Tiny fox cub found freezing near a highway. Trucker's quick decision saved more than its life. The wind cut through the February night like a blade, and the temperature had dropped well below freezing by the time Marcus Holden pulled his 18-wheeler onto the shoulder of Highway 89. It was just past 3 in the morning, and the road stretched empty in both directions, a ribbon of black asphalt bordered by snowbanks and skeletal trees. He'd been driving for 9 hours straight, hauling lumber from Oregon to Montana, and his body was screaming for rest. But it wasn't exhaustion that made him stop. It was the sound. At first, he thought he'd imagined it. A faint, high-pitched cry, barely audible over the hum of the engine. But when he killed the ignition and the cabin fell silent, he heard it again. A weak, desperate mewling that seemed to come from somewhere near the guardrail, just beyond the reach of his headlights. Marcus sat still for a moment, his calloused hands resting on the steering wheel, his breath fogging in the cold air. He'd been a trucker for 23 years, and he'd seen plenty of strange things on the road. Abandoned cars, lost hikers. Once, a deer tangled in barbed wire. But this sound was different. It was small, fragile, urgent. He grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the night. The cold hit him immediately, biting through his flannel jacket and jeans. He pulled his collar up and swept the beam of light across the roadside, moving carefully toward the source of the noise. The guardrail was twisted and dented in one section, as if something had crashed into it recently. Tire marks scarred the snow, veering sharply before disappearing into the ditch below. Marcus's stomach tightened. He quickened his pace, his boots crunching through the ice-crusted snow. That's when he saw it. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and stay with us. Huddled against the base of the guardrail, half buried in a drift of snow, was a tiny fox cub. Its fur was matted and dusted white, its body trembling violently. The animal was so small it could have fit in the palm of his hand. Its eyes, bright and amber, wide with fear, locked onto Marcus as he approached. It didn't run. It couldn't. One of its hind legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, and there were smears of blood on the snow around it. The cub let out another weak cry, and Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. He knelt down slowly, keeping his movements gentle. "Hey there, little one," he murmured, his voice soft despite the wind. "It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you." The cub flinched but didn't try to escape. Its breathing was shallow and rapid, each exhale a tiny puff of mist in the freezing air. Marcus set the flashlight on the ground and carefully removed his jacket, wrapping it around the fragile creature. The fox weighed almost nothing. Its body was cold to the touch, its heartbeat frantic beneath his fingers. He tucked it against his chest and stood, scanning the area with the flashlight one more time. That's when he noticed the other tracks, larger paw prints leading away from the guardrail, disappearing into the forest. An adult fox. Probably the mother. Marcus's jaw tightened. She'd been here, and she'd left. Whether it was injury, fear, or something worse, he didn't know. But the cub was alone now, and if he hadn't stopped, it would have frozen to death within the hour. Back in the warmth of the truck cabin, Marcus placed the cub on the passenger seat and turned the heat up as high as it would go. He pulled a wool blanket from behind his seat and wrapped the little fox more securely, leaving only its face exposed. The cub's eyes were half closed now, its trembling beginning to slow. That was either a good sign or a very bad one. Marcus grabbed his phone and dialed the only person he could think of at this hour. The line rang 4 times before a groggy voice answered. "Marcus, do you have any idea what time it is?" I know. Sarah, I need your help. I found a fox cub on the side of the highway. It's hurt. Badly." There was a pause, and then the sleepiness vanished from her voice. "How badly?" "Broken leg may be worse. It's half frozen. I don't know if it's going to make it." Sarah Chen had been a wildlife veterinarian for 12 years, and she and Marcus had crossed paths a few times over the years. Once when he'd helped her transport an injured eagle, and again when she'd patched up a stray dog he'd found near a truck stop. She was blunt, no nonsense, and she didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Where are you?" "Highway 89, about 40 miles south of Glacier Falls." "That's 2 hours from me. Can you keep it warm and stable until you get here?" Marcus looked at the tiny bundle on his seat. The cub's breathing was steadier now, but its body was still limp and unresponsive. "I'll do my best." "Good. Drive carefully. And Marcus, don't give it water or food. Just keep it warm. I'll meet you at the clinic." The line went dead. Marcus set the phone down and gently touched the cub's head with one finger. Its fur was softer than he'd expected, the color a rich russet beneath the dirt and snow. He'd never been much of an animal person. His life on the road didn't allow for pets, and he'd always kept his distance from wildlife. But sitting there in the dim glow of the dashboard lights, with this fragile life depending on him, something shifted. He didn't know why he'd stopped. Instinct, maybe? Or something deeper. He started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, driving slowly and deliberately, his eyes flicking between the road and the cub every few seconds. The miles stretched on, the darkness thick and endless. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, and the first flakes of a new snowstorm began to fall. Marcus thought about the tracks he'd seen, the mother fox vanishing into the woods. He wondered if she'd been injured too, or if she'd simply abandoned her young when the situation became too dangerous. Nature could be cruel that way. He didn't judge her for it. Survival was survival, but he couldn't shake the image of the cub, alone and freezing, crying out for help that never came. Until now. The cub stirred slightly, its small nose twitching. Marcus glanced over and saw that its eyes were open again, watching him with a strange, quiet intensity. There was no fear in that gaze now, just a kind of weary trust, as if the animal understood, on some instinctive level, that it was safe. "You're going to be okay," Marcus said quietly, more to himself than to the fox. "We're going to get you fixed up." He didn't know if that was true. He didn't know if the cub would survive the night, let alone the journey. But he'd made a decision the moment he stepped out of the truck, and he was going to see it through, whatever it took. The snow fell harder now, blanketing the highway in white. Marcus tightened his grip on the steering wheel and drove on through the storm, the tiny heartbeat beside him a fragile reminder of why he'd stopped in the first place. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a tunnel of white in the swirling snow. Marcus kept his speed steady at 45, well below the limit, his eyes darting between the road and the small passenger beside him. The cub had stopped shivering so violently, which Marcus hoped was a good sign. Its breathing had evened out, shallow but rhythmic, and occasionally it would shift slightly beneath the blanket, as if testing the warmth surrounding it. Marcus hadn't thought about his daughter in months. He'd trained himself not to. But now, with this fragile life depending on him, the memories came flooding back unbidden. Emma had been 7 when she'd found the injured sparrow in their backyard. She'd cradled it in her small hands, tears streaming down her face, begging him to help it. He'd tried. They'd made a little nest in a shoebox, fed it with an eyedropper, kept it warm. But the bird had died 2 days later, and Emma had been inconsolable. "Why didn't we save it, Daddy?" she'd asked, her voice breaking. "Sometimes trying is all we can do," he'd told her, feeling helpless and hollow. That was 14 years ago. Emma was 21 now, living in Seattle, studying marine biology. They talked maybe once a month, awkward conversations filled with long pauses and safe topics. The divorce had fractured more than his marriage. It had splintered his relationship with his daughter, too. She'd been 13 when he and Catherine had split, old enough to take sides, and she'd chosen her mother. Marcus didn't blame her. He'd been on the road more than he'd been home, chasing miles and paychecks while his family slowly dissolved around him. He glanced at the cub again. Its eyes were closed now, its tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Something about its vulnerability reminded him of Emma at that age. Small, trusting, believing that adults could fix anything if they just tried hard enough. "I'm not going to let you down," Marcus whispered to the fox. "Not this time." The GPS showed an hour and 20 minutes to Glacier Falls. The storm was intensifying, visibility dropping to barely 50 feet. Other truckers would have pulled over, waited it out. But Marcus pressed on, his jaw set, his hands steady on the wheel. He'd made a promise, to himself, to the cub, maybe to some ghost of the father he wished he'd been. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. He glanced at the screen. Sarah. He answered on speaker. Yeah? Status update. How's the cub? Breathing steady, not shivering as much, still not moving. That's actually good. The body conserves energy when it's in shock. As long as it's breathing, there's a chance. How far out are you? About an hour 15. The storm's getting worse. If you need to pull over, I'm not pulling over. There was a pause on the other end. Sarah knew him well enough not to argue. All right, I've got the clinic prepped. Heating pads, IV fluids, pain meds. I'll need to do x-rays, probably set the leg. If there's internal bleeding... She trailed off. There won't be, Marcus said, though he had no way of knowing that. You care about this, Fox, Sarah observed. It wasn't a question. Marcus didn't answer right away. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm, clearing crescents of visibility through the accumulating snow. I found it, he finally said. That makes it my responsibility. That's not how most people think. Yeah, well, he left it at that. After Sarah hung up, Marcus fell into the kind of focused silence he knew well from decades on the road. Just him, the engine, and the white lines disappearing beneath his wheels. But this time, he wasn't alone. The cub's presence filled the cabin with something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose that went beyond the next delivery, the next paycheck, the next empty motel room. Around mile marker 73, the cub suddenly stirred. Its eyes opened, wide and alert, and it let out a soft, plaintive sound, not the desperate cry from before, but something quieter, almost questioning. Hey there, Marcus said gently. We're getting close. You hang in there. The fox's amber eyes fixed on him, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. Marcus had heard people talk about connections with animals, about silent understanding passing between species. He'd always thought it was sentimental nonsense, but in that moment he could have sworn the cub understood him, understood that it was safe, that someone finally was fighting for it. The cub's tongue flicked out, licking its small black nose, and then its eyes drifted closed again. But this time there was something different about the way it settled, less collapse, more rest, like it had decided to trust him completely. Marcus felt his throat tighten. He cleared it roughly and refocused on the road. By the time he saw the lights of Glacier Falls emerging through the storm, it was nearly 5:30 in the morning. The town was small, maybe 3,000 people, the kind of place that existed mainly to service the national park and the highway. Marcus had passed through dozens of towns just like it over the years, never stopping for more than fuel and coffee. But tonight, it felt like a beacon. Sarah's clinic was on the east edge of town, a low brick building with a hand-painted sign, Chen Wildlife and Veterinary Care. The parking lot had been plowed recently, and lights blazed in every window. Marcus pulled in carefully, killed the engine, and sat for just a moment, his hand resting lightly on the blanket-wrapped bundle. We made it, he said quietly. The clinic door burst open before he could even climb out of the truck. Sarah emerged, bundled in a heavy coat, her black hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail. She was 42, compact and efficient, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Behind her came a younger man, probably an assistant, carrying a small animal carrier lined with heated pads. Marcus gathered the cub carefully, blanket and all, and stepped down from the truck. The wind immediately tried to tear the bundle from his arms, but he held firm, hunching his body protectively around the fox as he hurried toward the door. Inside! Quick! Sarah ordered, holding the door open. The warmth of the clinic hit Marcus like a wall. The space was clean and well lit, smelling faintly of antiseptic and cedar shavings. Sarah led him straight to an examination room, where a steel table had been prepared with towels, instruments, and monitoring equipment. Set it down here gently, Sarah instructed. Marcus carefully unwrapped the cub and placed it on the towels. Under the bright lights, the animal looked even more fragile than before. Its fur was dull and matted, its body far too thin. The injured leg was swollen, the paw twisted at a sickening angle, but its eyes were still alert, tracking movement in the room. Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision, checking vitals, examining the leg, palpating the tiny abdomen. Her assistant, a kid named Kyle, maybe 25, took notes and prepared equipment as Sarah called out observations. Heart rate elevated but strong, temperatures low but coming up, dehydration, malnutrition. The leg is definitely fractured, probably tibial fibula. No obvious signs of internal bleeding, but I'll need films to be sure. She glanced up at Marcus. You did good. Another hour out there and we'd be having a very different conversation. Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He stood against the wall, his jacket still damp with snow, watching as Sarah worked. The cub whimpered once when Sarah touched the injured leg, and Marcus flinched, as if he'd been struck. It's okay, Sarah said, though Marcus wasn't sure if she was talking to him or the fox. We're going to fix you up. She prepared a syringe, pain medication and a mild sedative, and administered it with a gentleness that belied her no-nonsense demeanor. Within minutes, the cub's body relaxed, its eyes growing heavy. Kyle, let's get x-rays. Marcus, you can wait in the front room. This'll take a while. But Marcus didn't move. I'd like to stay, if that's okay. Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, but stay back and stay quiet. For the next 90 minutes, Marcus watched as Sarah and Kyle worked to save the cub's life. He saw the x-ray images, the clean break in the leg, the miraculous absence of other fractures or internal damage. He watched Sarah set the bone with delicate precision, applying a tiny splint no bigger than a pencil. He saw the IV line placed, fluids dripping steadily into the small body, and through it all he felt something shifting inside himself, like ice breaking up after a long winter. He'd spent 23 years running from the failure of his marriage, from the distance with his daughter, from the loneliness that came with a life lived in transit. He'd convinced himself that solitude was easier, that needing nothing and no one made him strong. But standing there, watching a stranger fight to save a creature he'd found by pure chance, Marcus realized something. He'd been wrong. Connection wasn't weakness. Caring wasn't a liability. And sometimes, stopping to help something small and broken could save more than one life. By the time Sarah stepped back from the table, peeling off her gloves, the sun was beginning to rise outside. The cub lay sleeping peacefully, its breathing deep and even, its splinted leg supported by soft padding. It's going to make it, Sarah said, and she was smiling. Marcus exhaled a breath he felt like he'd been holding for hours. Yeah. It'll need round-the-clock care for at least a week, maybe 2. Medications, feeding every few hours, monitoring for infection. But it's young and it's a fighter. With the right care, she shrugged, it's got a real shot. Marcus looked at the sleeping cub, so small and vulnerable on the table, and felt something crack wide open in his chest. Not breaking, opening, like a door he'd kept locked for far too long. What happens now? He asked. Sarah wiped down her instruments, considering. Normally I'd keep it here until it's stable, then transfer it to a wildlife rehab facility. There's a good one about 3 hours north. They'd raise it until it's old enough to release back into the wild. Normally, Marcus repeated, catching the hesitation in her voice. Sarah met his eyes. But I'm running this place by myself right now. My partner just left for a month-long research trip. I've got 4 other critical patients and 2 surgeries scheduled this week. I can't give this cub the constant attention it needs. She paused. I don't suppose you'd consider sticking around for a few days. Marcus opened his mouth to say no, to explain that he had a delivery deadline, that he couldn't afford to lose the job, that he lived on the road and had no business playing nursemaid to a wild animal. But what came out was, what would I need to do? Sarah handed Marcus a sheet of laminated instructions covered in bullet points, feeding schedules, and medication dosages. The paper felt official and daunting in his rough hands. "It's not complicated," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But it is constant. This cub is maybe 6 weeks old, which means it should still be with its mother, nursing and learning to hunt. Without her, you become the mother." Marcus stared at the instructions, then at the sleeping fox on the table. "I don't know the first thing about raising a fox." "Neither did I the first time," Sarah admitted. She gestured for him to follow her to a back room, where shelves lined the walls, stocked with medical supplies, bottles, and equipment. She began pulling items down, explaining each one. "You'll need to feed it every 3 to 4 hours. Puppy milk replacer formula, not cow's milk, that'll kill it. Warm it to body temperature. Test it on your wrist like a baby bottle. Use this syringe feeder until it's strong enough to lap from a bowl." She set a bag of powder and several syringes on the counter, then continued. "Antibiotics twice a day for the leg. Pain medication as needed. You'll need to keep it warm. Foxes this young can't regulate their body temperature well yet. A heating pad on low, but not direct contact. Always a layer of blanket between." She pulled out a small pet carrier with soft bedding. "This will be home for now. Keep it clean, change the bedding daily. Watch for signs of infection, swelling, discharge, fever. If you see any of that, you call me immediately." Marcus nodded, trying to absorb the avalanche of information. Kyle appeared with a cardboard box filled with supplies, bottles, formula, medication bottles with typed labels, extra blankets, even a small stuffed animal. "For comfort," Kyle explained, looking almost embarrassed. "Sometimes they do better with something to cuddle against." "One more thing," Sarah said, her voice softening slightly. "Don't get too attached. I know that sounds impossible now, but this is a wild animal. The goal is always release. If you handle it too much, talk to it too much, let it bond with you, you'll make it dependent on humans, and a fox that trusts humans won't survive in the wild." Marcus looked at the cub through the open doorway, still sleeping peacefully on the examination table. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent half his life avoiding attachment, and now he was being warned against the very thing that had brought him here in the first place. "I understand," he said. Sarah studied him with those sharp, assessing eyes. "I don't think you do, but you will. Come on, let's get our patient settled." They transferred the cub carefully into the carrier, arranging the heating pad and blankets just so. The fox barely stirred, lost in medication-induced sleep. Sarah gave Marcus a crash course in checking vital signs, reading body language, recognizing distress signals. Then she walked him out to the front desk, where she'd already prepared a makeshift care station with written instructions, emergency numbers, and backup supplies. "I've got a cabin out back," Sarah said, surprising him. "I use it for overnight monitoring of critical patients sometimes. It's small, but it's got heat, a bed, and a bathroom. You're welcome to it for as long as you need." Marcus hadn't even thought about where he'd stay. The motel down the highway was the obvious choice, but the idea of trying to care for the cub in a dingy room with questionable heating made his chest tight. "I can pay rent," he said. Sarah waved him off. "Save your money for when you have to explain to your employer why you're a week behind schedule." That reminder hit Marcus like cold water. He pulled out his phone and stepped away, dialing his dispatcher. It was 6:15 in the morning. Tom would be in the office, already on his third coffee. The conversation was exactly as uncomfortable as Marcus expected. Tom listened to the explanation. "Fox cub, highway, veterinarian, need a few days," with increasingly pointed silence. "Marcus, you're one of our most reliable drivers," Tom finally said, his voice tight with frustration. "But this load was supposed to be in Billings yesterday. We've got clients screaming, penalties piling up. I can reassign the truck, but this is coming out of your pay. And I can't guarantee your next route for at least 2 weeks. "I understand," Marcus said. 2 weeks without work meant 2 weeks without income. His savings were thin. Truck drivers didn't exactly get rich, but he'd manage. Somehow. "You're really doing this? For a fox?" Marcus looked through the doorway at the carrier, at the small bundle of russet fur barely visible among the blankets. "Yeah," he said simply. "I really am." After he hung up, Sarah was waiting with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one without comment, but there was something like approval in her eyes. "The cabin's open. Keys under the mat. Very secure, I know. Get some sleep. The cub won't wake for another few hours, and you look like hell." Marcus started to protest, but exhaustion hit him all at once. 26 hours without sleep, the stress of the drive, the emotional weight of the morning. He nodded gratefully and carried the cub in its carrier out to the small cabin behind the clinic. The space was exactly as Sarah described, small but functional. A single bed with a thick quilt, a kitchenette with a 2-burner stove, a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. But it was warm and clean, and right now it felt like a palace. Marcus set the carrier on the bedside table where he could watch the cub, then collapsed onto the bed fully clothed. He meant to sleep for just an hour or 2, but his body had other ideas. When he woke, disoriented and stiff, the light coming through the window was golden and slanting, late afternoon. He shot upright, heart pounding, and looked at the carrier. The cub was awake. 2 amber eyes stared at him through the mesh door, alert and curious. The fox was sitting up, awkwardly favoring the splintered leg, but decidedly conscious. When it saw Marcus move, it made a soft chittering sound, almost like a question. "Hey there," Marcus said, his voice rough with sleep. "You feeling better?" The cub tilted its head, and Marcus could have sworn it was studying him. He glanced at his phone. 4:30 in the afternoon. The feeding schedule said every 3 to 4 hours, and the last feeding had been, he calculated backward, at least 10 hours ago. "Ah, hell, you must be starving." He fumbled for the supplies, following Sarah's instructions to mix the formula. 1 part powder to 2 parts warm water. Shake well. Test the temperature. His hands, so steady when handling 50-foot trailers, felt clumsy with the tiny bottle. But he managed it, and when he opened the carrier and gently lifted the cub out, it didn't struggle. The fox was lighter than he remembered, its body fragile beneath his palms. He settled onto the bed with his back against the headboard, the cub cradled in the crook of his arm like an infant. When he brought the syringe to its mouth, the little fox latched on immediately, sucking with desperate hunger. "Easy, easy," Marcus murmured, controlling the flow so it wouldn't choke. Not too fast. The cub's eyes never left his face as it drank, its small paws kneading against his chest. Marcus felt something twist in his heart, that same protective surge he'd felt on the highway, but deeper now, more real. This wasn't just rescue anymore, this was care, connection, responsibility that went beyond a single night. When the formula was gone, the cub licked its chops and let out a satisfied chirp. Marcus carefully wiped its face with a damp cloth, checking the splint like Sarah had shown him. Everything looked stable. He started to place the fox back in the carrier, but it made a distressed sound and tried to cling to his shirt with its tiny claws. "You don't want to go back in there, huh?" Marcus said softly. The cub burrowed against his chest, seeking warmth and comfort. Sarah's warning echoed in his mind, "Don't get too attached," but it felt absurd now. How could he not be attached? This creature had been dying alone in the snow, and now it was falling asleep in his arms, trusting him completely. Marcus sat there as the afternoon light faded to dusk, holding the sleeping fox, feeling its heartbeat against his palm. He thought about Emma again, about all the moments he'd missed because he'd been driving through the night, chasing the next job. He thought about Catherine, about how she'd begged him to take the regional routes, to be home more than 2 days a month, and how he'd insisted the long hauls paid better, as if money could compensate for absence. He'd told himself he was providing for his family, but the truth, the one he'd never wanted to face, was that he'd been running from the messiness of marriage, from the demands of fatherhood, from the terrifying vulnerability of being truly needed. The road had been his escape, loneliness disguised as independence. But this, holding this fragile life, knowing it depended entirely on him, feeling its trust like a weight and a gift, this was what he'd been running from. And for the first time in decades, Marcus didn't want to run. He wanted to stay. A knock on the cabin door startled him. Sarah poked her head in, saw Marcus on the bed with the cub, and smiled. "First feeding went okay?" "Yeah, it drank the whole syringe." "Good. That's a very good sign." She came in, checking the cub with professional efficiency, examining the splint, testing temperature. "Perfect. You're a natural." Marcus doubted that, but he appreciated the encouragement. Sarah settled into the small chair by the kitchenette, and something about her posture told him she had more to say. "I went back to the site this afternoon," she said. "Where you found it. I wanted to see if I could find any sign of the mother or other cubs." Or Marcus's attention sharpened, and Sarah's expression grew somber. "I found her about 100 yards into the woods. She'd been hit by a car. Probably the same incident that injured the cub. She'd dragged herself away from the road, but she didn't make it far. She'd been dead for at least 12 hours by the time I found her." The cabin fell silent, except for the soft breathing of the sleeping cub. Marcus felt a hollowness open in his chest. So it was alone all that time, waiting for her. "Yes, and here's the thing. I found the den. There were 2 other cubs, dead. They'd frozen during the night." Sarah's voice was gentle but unflinching. "This one survived because it was the strongest. It crawled toward the road, towards sound and light, probably on pure instinct. If you hadn't stopped—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Marcus looked down at the small fox in his arms, and suddenly its survival felt less like chance and more like something else. Purpose. Fate. A second chance, not just for the cub, but for him. "The mother tried to get back to them," Sarah continued. "There were drag marks, blood trail. She fought to survive, to get back to her babies. But sometimes fighting isn't enough." She met Marcus's eyes. "Sometimes we need someone to stop for us, to see us when we're too small or too hurt to save ourselves." Marcus understood what she was really saying. This wasn't just about the fox. It was about every creature, human or animal, that had ever been left alone in the cold, crying out for help. It was about Emma, maybe, when her parents' marriage fell apart and she'd needed a father who was present. It was about Catherine, who'd needed a partner instead of a ghost who came home every few weeks. It was about Marcus himself, who'd spent 2 decades alone in a truck cab, pretending that solitude was the same as strength. "I'm going to see this through," Marcus said quietly. "However long it takes." Sarah nodded, standing. "I thought you might say that. We'll do it together, one day at a time." After she left, Marcus sat in the gathering darkness, the cub warm against his heart. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't feel alone. He felt needed, and that made all the difference. The first 3 days were the hardest. Marcus learned quickly that caring for a fox cub was nothing like the instructions made it seem. The laminated sheet Sarah had given him was helpful, but it couldn't prepare him for the reality of a wild animal in recovery. The unpredictable sleep patterns, the sudden bursts of distress, the delicate balance between providing comfort and maintaining the distance Sarah had warned him about. On the first night, the cub woke every 2 hours, crying with a sound that pierced straight through Marcus's chest. Each time, he'd stumble out of bed, mix the formula with half-closed eyes, and feed the little fox in the dim light of the bedside lamp. The cub would drink hungrily, then refuse to settle back in the carrier, whimpering until Marcus held it against his chest. He'd sit propped against the headboard, the warm weight of the fox tucked under his chin, waiting until it fell back asleep before attempting to transfer it back. By dawn of the second day, Marcus gave up on the carrier entirely. He arranged pillows and blankets on the bed to create a safe nest, keeping the heating pad nearby, but allowing the cub to sleep beside him. It was probably against Sarah's rules, but the fox was calmer this way, and Marcus figured rest was more important than protocol. Sarah came by twice a day to check on them, morning and evening rounds, she called it. She'd examine the splint, administer medications, monitor healing progress. She never commented on the sleeping arrangement, though Marcus caught her suppressing a smile more than once. "Legs looking good," she said on the third morning, gently manipulating the splintered limb while the cub chittered in protest. "No signs of infection. It's eating well, staying hydrated, temperature's back to normal. This little one's a fighter." "It is," Marcus agreed. He was sitting cross-legged on the bed in sweatpants and a t-shirt, his hair sticking up at odd angles. He'd driven to the local store the previous afternoon for basic supplies, toiletries, a change of clothes, more coffee than any human should consume. The clerk had asked if he was visiting family in the area, and Marcus had hesitated before saying yes. It felt true, somehow. "Have you named it?" Sarah asked, packing up her medical bag. "I thought I wasn't supposed to get attached." "I think that ship has sailed, Marcus." She gestured at the bed, where the cub was now curled up on a pillow, watching them with bright, alert eyes. "Besides, you need to call it something. AU gets confusing when I have 5 other patients." Marcus had been thinking about this, actually. Late at night, when he couldn't sleep, listening to the small, snuffling sounds the fox made. "Ember," he said finally. "Because of the color, and because, I don't know, it survived when it shouldn't have. Like a spark that refused to go out." Sarah smiled, a real smile, warm and approving. "Ember. I like it, though technically we don't know if it's male or female yet. Too young to tell easily, and I didn't want to stress it with a thorough exam." "Doesn't matter," Marcus said. "Ember works either way." After Sarah left, Marcus sat with his coffee, watching Ember explore the limited space of the bed with awkward, 3-legged determination. The splint made movement difficult, but the cub was adapting, learning to balance, to hop and drag rather than walk. There was something inspiring about it, this refusal to be limited by injury, this instinct to move forward despite everything. Marcus pulled out his phone and stared at it for a long moment. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he pulled up Emma's contact and started typing. "Hey, Em. I know it's been a while. Something happened that made me think of you. Remember that sparrow you found when you were little? I'm taking care of a fox cub now. Found it on the highway. Thought you'd want to know." He attached a photo, Ember curled up on the pillow, one ear perked up, looking impossibly small and impossibly alive. Then he hit send before he could overthink it. The response came faster than he expected. 3 minutes later his phone buzzed. "Dad? Are you serious? That's amazing. Is it okay? What happened? Tell me everything." Marcus felt his throat tighten. She'd called him Dad. She hadn't done that in years. It had been Marcus for so long he'd almost forgotten how the other word sounded. He typed out the story, keeping it simple but honest. The highway, the snow, the decision to stop, the broken leg, Sarah's clinic, the choice to stay. Emma's messages came rapid fire, questions, exclamations, demands for more photos. Marcus found himself smiling as he responded, taking pictures of Ember from different angles, describing the feeding schedule, the recovery process. It was the longest conversation they'd had in 3 years. "This is so you, Dad," Emma wrote. "Mom always said you had a soft spot for lost things. You just never let anyone see it." Had Catherine really said that? Marcus tried to remember, but the details of his marriage had blurred over time, leaving only the broad strokes, the arguments, the disappointments, the final resigned silence. Maybe she'd known something about him that he hadn't known about himself. "I'm proud of you," Emma added, "for stopping, for staying. That takes real courage." Marcus stared at those words for a long time. Courage. He'd never thought of it that way. Stopping had felt less like bravery and more like inevitability, the only choice he could live with. But maybe that's what courage was. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear make your decisions. "Thanks, Em," he typed back. "That means a lot. Send me updates. I want to know how Ember does. I will, I promise," and he meant it. The days fell into a rhythm. Wake, feed, clean, medicate, watch. Marcus found himself attuned to Ember's every sound and movement. He learned to distinguish between the hungry chirp and the lonely whimper, between the contented trill and the pain cry. He learned that Ember liked to sleep in patches of sunlight, that certain sounds, the whistle of the kettle, the creak of the cabin door, would make those ears swivel and perk. He learned that foxes were incredibly vocal, making sounds he'd never imagined, geckering when annoyed, a soft whine when seeking attention, a surprisingly dog-like bark when startled. Sarah brought by enrichment items, small toys, different textures, even a shallow box filled with dirt for digging practice. Wild animals need mental stimulation, she explained. It's not enough to keep them alive. We have to keep their instincts sharp if they're going back to the wild. That phrase, going back to the wild, hung in the air between them. Marcus knew it was the goal. It had to be the goal. But each day that passed made the idea more abstract, more difficult to imagine. How could he release this creature that trusted him completely, that fell asleep in his hands, that looked for him the moment it woke? On the 5th day, Sarah removed the splint temporarily to check the bone's healing progress. Marcus held Ember steady, while Sarah took X-rays with a portable machine she'd hauled over from the clinic. They studied the images together on Sarah's laptop. "Look at that," Sarah said, pointing to the screen. "The bone's already starting to knit. Another week, maybe 10 days, and we can remove the splint entirely. After that, physical therapy to rebuild strength, and then—" She glanced at Marcus. "Then we start preparing for release." Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He focused on Ember, who was investigating Sarah's stethoscope with intense concentration, batting at it with one small paw. "There's a protocol," Sarah continued gently. "Gradual reintroduction to wild behaviors, reducing human contact, eventually moving to an outdoor enclosure where they can experience natural conditions. The Wildlife Rehab Center I mentioned, they specialize in this. They've successfully released dozens of foxes." "How long does it take? The whole process?" "Depends on the animal. For a cub this young, probably another 6 to 8 weeks minimum. They need to be old enough to hunt, to recognize predators, to establish territory. We're looking at late spring, early summer for release." Late spring. 2 months away, maybe more. Marcus tried to imagine it. Walking away from Ember, watching it disappear into the forest, never knowing if it survived or thrived or even remembered him. The thought sat in his chest like a stone. That evening, after Sarah left, Marcus sat on the cabin's small porch with Ember bundled in a blanket on his lap. It was early March now, and the brutal cold had softened into something almost bearable. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Ember's nose twitched constantly, processing the outdoor smells, pine, snow, the distant scent of the highway. "This is your world," Marcus said quietly. "Out there. Not in here with me." Ember looked up at him with those amber eyes, and Marcus could have sworn the little fox understood. Not the words, but the emotion behind them. The grief of loving something you knew you had to let go. His phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "How's our patient today?" "Our patient." Marcus smiled. He took a photo of Ember on his lap with the sunset behind them and sent it. "Getting stronger every day. You look different, Dad. Happier." Marcus studied the photo he'd just sent. He did look different. The permanent tension in his jaw had eased. The lines around his eyes looked less like exhaustion and more like character. When had that happened? "I feel different," he admitted. "Good different?" "Yeah, good different." That night, Marcus lay awake long after Ember had fallen asleep beside him. He thought about the weeks ahead, the healing, the preparation, the inevitable goodbye. He thought about what came after, when his time in Glacier Falls ended and he returned to the road. Would he go back to the same isolated existence, different town each night? No connections deeper than a signature on a delivery receipt? Or had something fundamentally changed? Had stopping on that frozen highway, making one impulsive, illogical, completely necessary decision, altered his trajectory permanently? He didn't have answers yet. But lying there in the darkness, listening to Ember's soft breathing, feeling the warm weight of trust and responsibility and unexpected joy, Marcus knew one thing with absolute certainty. He couldn't go back to the way things were. He'd opened a door he couldn't close. He'd remembered what it felt like to be needed, to care, to stay. And whatever happened next, with Ember, with Emma, with the rest of his life, he was done running. Ember stirred in sleep, making a small sound like a sigh. Marcus reached out and gently rested his hand on the cub's back, feeling the heartbeat beneath fur and bone. "I've got you," he whispered, "for as long as you need me." The promise hung in the dark cabin, witnessed by no one but a sleeping fox, and the man who'd finally stopped long enough to save something, and in doing so, had saved himself. The crisis came without warning on day 12. Marcus woke at 4 in the morning to a sound he'd never heard Ember make, a high-pitched, desperate keening that sent his heart into his throat. He shot upright and found the cub convulsing on the bed, its small body rigid, legs jerking uncontrollably. Foam flecked the corners of its mouth. "No, no, no," Marcus breathed, scooping Ember up with trembling hands. The fox felt like fire against his palms, burning hot, skin radiating heat through the fur. Seizure, fever, something catastrophically wrong. He was out the cabin door in seconds, barefoot in the snow, running for the clinic. The lights were off. Sarah wouldn't be there for another 3 hours. Marcus didn't care. He pounded on the door with his fist, holding Ember against his chest with his other arm, feeling each violent spasm like a punch to his gut. "Sarah! Sarah, I need you!" Lights flickered on in the apartment above the clinic. 30 seconds later, Sarah appeared at the door in pajama pants and a sweatshirt, her hair wild. One look at Marcus's face, and she was moving, unlocking the clinic, hitting lights, her voice sharp and focused. "Exam room 2. Now." "What happened?" "I don't know. It was fine when we went to sleep. I woke up and—" Marcus's voice cracked. "It won't stop shaking." Sarah took Ember from him, her hands steady even as Marcus's shook. She laid the cub on the examination table, already assessing. "Temperature, Kyle!" she barked, and Marcus realized the young assistant had appeared as well, moving with practiced efficiency. The thermometer reading made Sarah's jaw tighten. 106.3. That's critical. She was already drawing medications, preparing syringes. Sepsis. The leg wound must have gotten infected despite the antibiotics. Bacteria entered the bloodstream. She inserted an IV line with precision that would have been impressive if Marcus hadn't been frozen with terror. "This is bad, Marcus. I'm not going to lie to you. If we can't bring the fever down in the next hour—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The next 3 hours were the longest of Marcus's life. He watched helplessly as Sarah and Kyle worked. IV fluids, antibiotics, anti-seizure medication, cooling measures. They packed Ember in cool towels, changed them every few minutes, monitored temperature constantly. The cub's body gradually stopped convulsing, but it didn't wake. It lay limp and unresponsive, breathing shallow and rapid. "Come on, little one," Sarah murmured, checking vitals for the 100th time. "Fight. You've fought this hard. Don't stop now." Marcus stood against the wall, arms wrapped around himself, watching the small rise and fall of Ember's chest. He'd felt fear before, the fear of losing his marriage, of losing connection with Emma, of dying alone on some anonymous highway. But this was different. This was watching something he loved slip away, powerless to stop it. "You shouldn't have gotten attached," a voice in his head whispered. "This is why you don't stop. This is why you keep moving, because stopping means caring, and caring means this agony of potential loss." But even as the thought formed, Marcus rejected it. Because the alternative, driving past Ember on that frozen highway, never knowing, never trying, was worse than any pain he felt now. At least if Ember died, it would die knowing someone had fought for it, that it hadn't been alone at the end. "Marcus." Sarah's voice pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. "Temperature's dropping. 104. That's good. That's movement in the right direction. Hope flickered, fragile and terrifying. It's going to make it. I don't know yet, but it's fighting. We just need it to keep fighting. By 8 o'clock, Ember's temperature had dropped to 103, then 102. The crisis wasn't over, but the immediate danger had passed. Sarah looked exhausted, her face drawn. It needs constant monitoring for the next 48 hours. Temperature checks every 30 minutes, medication every 2 hours, IV fluids continuous. If the fever spikes again... She met Marcus's eyes. I have to be honest, I can't do this alone. I have other patients, surgeries scheduled. I need someone here full-time, and I can't ask Kyle to... I'll do it, Marcus said immediately. Whatever you need, I'll do it. Marcus, it's round the clock. No sleep, constant vigilance. I said I'll do it. Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, I'll show you what to watch for. Marcus didn't leave the clinic for the next 2 days. Sarah set up a cot in the exam room, brought him food he barely touched, coffee he consumed by the gallon. He learned to read the monitors, to administer medications, to recognize the subtle signs of distress or improvement. Every 30 minutes, he took Ember's temperature. Every 2 hours, he gave antibiotics through the IV line. In between, he sat beside the examination table, his hand resting lightly on the cub's side, feeling each breath like a gift. Emma called on the second night. Marcus answered with his free hand, his voice rough from exhaustion and lack of sleep. Dad, you sound terrible. What's wrong? He told her everything. The seizure, the sepsis, the fight for Ember's life. The words came easier than he expected, maybe because he was too tired to maintain his usual walls. Oh, Dad, Emma said, and her voice was thick with emotion. I'm so sorry. Do you want me to come? I could drive up there. It's only 7 hours. Marcus's throat tightened. You'd do that? Of course I would. You're going through this alone, and I'm not alone, Marcus said, surprising himself. Sarah's been incredible. And I have Ember. Even like this, I have... He trailed off, unable to articulate the feeling. You have purpose, Emma finished softly. You have something worth fighting for. I get it, Dad. I really do. They talked for another hour, and somewhere in that conversation, years of distance began to close. Emma told him about her studies, about a research project on ocean conservation, about a guy she'd been seeing who made her laugh. Marcus told her about the road, about the loneliness he'd carried for so long, about how Ember had changed something fundamental in him. I think I've been asleep for 20 years, he admitted. Just going through the motions. And then I stopped for this fox. And it was like waking up, realizing I'd missed everything that mattered. You're awake now, Emma said. That's what counts. After they hung up, Marcus looked at Ember, still unconscious, still fighting, and made a decision. He pulled out his phone and started typing an email to his dispatcher, a formal resignation, 23 years as a long-haul trucker, ending with a few paragraphs sent from a veterinary clinic at 2 in the morning. He didn't know what came next. He had maybe 4 months of savings, no real plan, no safety net, but he knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't go back to that old life. He'd changed too much. He wanted different things now, connection, community, the ability to stop when something needed him. He hit send before he could second-guess himself, then returned his attention to Ember. Just you and me now, little one, he murmured. No more running. I'm here. I'm staying. On the morning of the 3rd day, Ember's eyes opened. It happened slowly, a flutter of eyelids, a slight movement of the head. Then those amber eyes focused on Marcus, clouded with exhaustion but undeniably aware. The cub made a soft sound, barely more than a breath, but to Marcus it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. "Hey," he said, his voice breaking. "Welcome back." Sarah came in minutes later. Marcus had texted her the moment Ember woke and conducted a thorough examination. Temperature normal, heart rate stable, neurological responses good. The crisis had passed. "I can't believe it pulled through," Sarah said, genuine wonder in her voice. "The odds were, well, they weren't good. But it fought, and you fought for it. She looked at Marcus, really looked at him. "You saved its life, Marcus." Again. But Marcus was thinking about what Emma had said. You have something worth fighting for, because that's what this had been. A fight not just to save Ember, but to save the part of himself that Ember had awakened. The part that cared, that stayed, that refused to give up, even when giving up would have been easier. Word spread through Glacier Falls faster than Marcus expected. Small towns had their own communication networks, and apparently the trucker who'd stopped for a dying fox and then quit his job to nurse it through sepsis was news. People started showing up at the clinic, not many, just one or two at a time, but enough to notice. They brought things: a donated pet crate for when Ember was stronger, a handmade blanket, casseroles for Marcus because you need to eat something besides coffee and granola bars. An elderly woman named Helen brought a photo album. "My husband found an orphaned fawn 40 years ago," she explained, showing Marcus pictures of a man bottle feeding a spotted deer. Everyone said he was crazy, that it wouldn't survive, but he didn't care what people said. He did what was right. She patted Marcus's hand with her weathered fingers. "You remind me of him. We need more people like you. People who stop." A teenager named Zoe, who worked at the local diner, created an Instagram account for Ember's recovery. Just Ember the Fox started trending locally, then regionally. People followed the updates, shared the story, donated to Sarah's clinic to cover medical costs. It became bigger than Marcus, bigger than one fox. It became a story about compassion, about the choice to help even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs you something. Kyle showed Marcus the comments section one afternoon. Hundreds of messages from strangers. "This story gives me hope. I stopped to help a stray dog yesterday because of this. She's at the vet now getting treatment." Sometimes we need reminders that individual actions matter. "Thank you for stopping." Marcus stared at the screen, overwhelmed. I just found a fox," he said quietly. "No," Sarah said from the doorway. She'd been listening. "You did something harder than that. You let yourself care. In a world that tells us to keep moving, to mind our own business, to protect ourselves from inconvenience, you stopped, you stayed, you fought, and people see that. They need that." That evening, Marcus sat in the cabin with Ember curled in his lap, still weak, but alive and eating and making those soft chittering sounds that meant contentment. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Mom called. I told her about you and Ember. She said to tell you she's proud of you. And Dad, so am I." Marcus read the message 3 times, vision blurring. Catherine was proud of him. Emma was proud of him. But more than that, he was proud of himself. For the first time in decades, he'd done something that mattered, not because it paid well, or looked good, or fit a schedule. He'd done it because it was right, because a small, broken creature had needed him, and he'd chosen to answer that need. He thought about the title he'd given himself for so long. Trucker, loner, failure as a husband and father. But maybe those definitions had been too narrow. Maybe he'd always had this capacity for care, for courage, for staying. He just hadn't known where to direct it, or maybe he'd been too afraid to try. Ember looked up at him with those amber eyes, and Marcus stroked the soft fur between its ears. "You saved me too, you know," he whispered. "More than you'll ever understand." Outside, the March snow was beginning to melt, revealing the brown earth beneath. Spring was coming, and with it, the next challenge, preparing Ember for release, for the wild life it was meant to live. Marcus knew that letting go would hurt worse than anything, but he also knew he'd do it. Because real love wasn't about holding on. It was about giving something the freedom to become what it was meant to be, even if that meant saying goodbye. But that was tomorrow's pain. Tonight, Ember was alive. Marcus wasn't alone, and somewhere in the space between stopping and staying, he'd found his way back to himself. And that, he thought, was worth every sacrifice he'd made. Spring arrived in Glacier Falls the way it always did, reluctantly in fits and starts. By late March, patches of green appeared beneath the melting snow, and the air carried the scent of thawing earth and pine sap. Ember's recovery mirrored the season, slow but undeniable, each day bringing small victories. The splint came off in week 3. Sarah removed it carefully, while Marcus held Ember steady, both of them watching as the cub tentatively tested the leg. There was a slight limp, a hesitation, but the bone had healed straight and strong. Within days, Ember was moving with increasing confidence, hopping less and walking more, even attempting small jumps from the bed to the floor. "Physical therapy time," Sarah announced one morning, arriving at the cabin with a determined expression and an armload of equipment. She'd brought small obstacles, low boxes, ramps, textured surfaces, designed to rebuild muscle and coordination. Wild foxes are incredibly agile. If Ember's going to survive out there, it needs full mobility. They set up the obstacle course in the fenced yard behind the clinic. Marcus watched as Sarah coaxed Ember through the exercises, using treats and encouragement. The cub was hesitant at first, but curiosity eventually won out. Within an hour, Ember was navigating the course with growing enthusiasm, pouncing on toys, practicing the sudden direction changes that foxes used to evade predators. "Look at that," Sarah said, genuine delight in her voice. "Natural instincts kicking in. That's exactly what we want to see." But Marcus noticed something else. Every few minutes, Ember would stop and look back at him, as if checking that he was still there, as if seeking approval or reassurance. And each time those amber eyes found his, Marcus felt his heart clench a little tighter. Sarah saw it too. "We need to talk about the next phase," she said that evening, after Ember had exhausted itself and fallen asleep in the cabin. They sat on the porch with mugs of tea, watching the sun set behind the mountains. "The rehab center I mentioned, I contacted them. They have space available in 2 weeks." Marcus had known this was coming, but hearing it stated so plainly still felt like a blow. 2 weeks. Ember's strong enough now. The center has outdoor enclosures that mimic natural habitat. They'll continue the socialization process, teaching hunting behaviors, reducing human contact, preparing for release. Sarah's voice was gentle, but firm. "It's what's best for Ember." "I know," Marcus said, and he did. Intellectually, he understood that every day Ember spent with him made eventual release harder. But emotionally, the thought of handing over this creature he'd saved, nursed, fought for, it felt like tearing out a piece of himself. "You can visit," Sarah offered. "They allow it at first. Then they gradually reduce human interaction as release day approaches." Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He stared at his tea, watching steam rise into the cooling air. "How do you do it?" he asked finally. "Care for them, save them, and then just let them go?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "I don't think of it as letting go," she said. "I think of it as giving them the gift of their own life. We're temporary. We're the bridge between injury and healing, between helplessness and independence. Our job is to make ourselves unnecessary." She looked at him with understanding. "It hurts every single time, but it hurts because we love them, and that love is what makes the release possible. We do the hard thing because it's the right thing." That night, Marcus lay awake with Ember curled against his side, listening to the soft sounds of sleep. He thought about bridges, how they connected 2 places but belonged to neither, how their purpose was to be crossed and then left behind. Maybe that's what he was. A bridge for Ember, between death and life, between that frozen highway and the wild forest that was its birthright. The thought should have brought comfort, but it only made the ache deeper. Emma called the next morning, her voice bright with excitement. "Dad, I have news. I'm coming to visit. Spring break starts Friday. I want to meet Ember before it has to go." "Emma, you don't have to." "I want to. I need to. And honestly, I want to see you too. See this place that changed you." She arrived 3 days later, driving up in a beat-up Honda with a duffel bag and a nervous smile. Marcus saw her pull into the clinic parking lot and felt his heart kick. 7 years since they'd been in the same room. 7 years of phone calls and careful distance, and now here she was, climbing out of her car, looking so much like her mother but with his eyes, his stubborn jaw. "Hi, Dad," she said, and then she was hugging him, fierce and tight, and Marcus held on like she might disappear if he let go. "Hi, sweetheart," he managed, his voice rough. "I'm so glad you're here." He introduced her to Sarah first, then to Kyle, and finally to the cluster of locals who'd taken to stopping by the clinic to check on Ember's progress. Emma charmed them all, asking questions, taking photos, listening to stories with genuine interest. Helen showed her the photo album again, and Zoe updated her on the Instagram account, which now had over 50,000 followers. "You're kind of famous, Dad," Emma said, laughing. "The fox trucker." "God, please don't let that become a thing," Marcus groaned. But the moment Emma met Ember, everything else fell away. The cub was napping in a patch of sunlight in the yard, and when Marcus brought Emma over, Ember lifted its head, ears perking forward with curiosity. Emma knelt slowly, following Marcus's whispered instructions, and extended her hand. Ember approached cautiously, sniffing, assessing. Then, apparently deciding this newcomer was acceptable, the cub bumped its head against Emma's palm in a gesture that was unmistakably affectionate. Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Dad, it's beautiful. It's perfect." They spent the afternoon together, Marcus, Emma, and Ember. Marcus showed her the feeding routine, the physical therapy exercises, the little personality quirks he'd learned. How Ember loved to hide treats and hunt for them later. How certain sounds would make its ears swivel in that endearing way. How it would groom itself meticulously after every meal, taking pride in its appearance. "It's wild," Emma observed, watching Ember stalk a toy mouse with exaggerated focus. "But it trusts you completely. How does that work?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "Sarah says I need to break that trust before release, make Ember wary of humans again, so it stays safe. I know she's right, but it feels like betrayal." "Yeah." Emma was quiet for a moment, watching Ember pounce on the toy with triumphant glee. "You know what I think? I think Ember will always remember you. Maybe not consciously, but somewhere deep. You were there when it needed someone most. That doesn't just disappear." Marcus hoped she was right. That evening, the three of them, Marcus, Emma, and Sarah, sat around a small fire behind the cabin, Ember curled in a secure outdoor pen nearby, where it could see the flames and hear their voices. Sarah had brought supplies for s'mores, and Emma declared them the worst she'd ever tasted, which made Marcus laugh harder than he had in years. "So what's next for you, Dad?" Emma asked, licking marshmallow from her fingers. "After Ember goes to the rehab center?" Marcus had been thinking about this constantly. "Sarah offered me a job," he said, glancing at the veterinarian. "Part-time, helping with rescues, patient care, maintenance. It doesn't pay much, but there's an apartment above the clinic that needs a tenant." "I figured you'd be good at it," Sarah said with a shrug. "You're patient, detail-oriented, and animals respond to you. Plus, I could use the help. Kyle's great, but he's heading to vet school in the fall." "You'd stay here?" Emma asked, her expression unreadable. "In Glacier Falls?" "I'm thinking about it. The road doesn't call to me anymore." Marcus stared into the fire, choosing his words carefully. "For 23 years, I kept moving because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. Be the provider, make the money, stay out of the way. But I was really just running. From failure, from connection, from the risk of caring too much. And then Ember happened, and I realized I don't want to run anymore. I want to be somewhere, for something, for someone." Emma's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I think that's the bravest thing I've ever heard you say." "Yeah, well," Marcus cleared his throat. "Better late than never, right?" "Dad, Emma hesitated, then pushed forward. "I want you to know. I get it now. Why you were always gone. You were doing what you thought was right, providing for us. I was angry for a long time, but I understand now. and what you're doing here, stopping, staying, choosing something different that takes more courage than just keeping on the same path. Marcus reached over and squeezed her hand. I should have stopped sooner, should have been there for you and your mom. I can't get those years back, but maybe I can do better going forward. You already are, Emma said simply. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. In the pen, Ember made soft sleeping sounds, safe and warm. Above them, stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the forest, a real fox called, a high, eerie sound that carried across the valley. Ember's ears twitched at the sound, even in sleep, recognizing something, responding to something primal and ancient. A reminder that no matter how much it trusted Marcus, no matter how comfortable it became in human spaces, it belonged out there, in the wild, in the night, among its own kind. 2 weeks, Marcus said quietly, more to himself than to the others. Sarah leaned forward, poking the fire with a stick. It's going to be okay, Marcus. Hard, but okay. Ember will thrive, and so will you. Emma rested her head on his shoulder, something she hadn't done since she was small. You gave it a chance, Dad. That's everything. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his daughter beside him, the warmth of the fire, the peace of this moment. He thought about highways and snow, about tiny cries in the darkness, about the split-second decision that had changed everything. He thought about bridges and belonging, about letting go and holding on, about how sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing were exactly the same. And he thought about 2 more weeks. 2 more weeks of watching Ember grow stronger, preparing for goodbye, learning to love something enough to set it free. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever was. But sitting there under the stars, surrounded by people who mattered, knowing he'd made a difference in one small, fragile life. Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in decades. He felt at peace. The day came too quickly and not quickly enough. Marcus woke on the appointed morning to find Ember already awake, sitting at the cabin window, watching birds flit through the budding trees. The cub had grown significantly in the past 2 weeks, sleeker, stronger, more alert. Its coat had thickened and glossed with proper nutrition, the russet fur catching the morning light like copper. The limp was barely noticeable now, just the slightest hesitation when it ran full speed. It was ready. Marcus knew it was ready. That didn't make this any easier. Sarah arrived at 8 with the transport carrier, larger than the one they'd used that first desperate night, designed for a juvenile fox rather than a dying cub. Emma stood beside Marcus as they watched Sarah prepare, her hand finding his and squeezing tight. You want to do it? Sarah asked gently. Or should I? Marcus swallowed hard. I should. It should be me. He knelt beside Ember, who approached him immediately, that familiar trust radiating from every movement. Marcus ran his hand along the cub's back one last time, memorizing the feel of the fur, the warmth, the small vibration of contentment. You're going on an adventure, he said softly. You're going to learn to be exactly what you were always meant to be, wild, free, strong. Ember chittered, bumping its head against his hand. Marcus's vision blurred. I'm so proud of you, he whispered. You fought so hard. You survived when you shouldn't have, and now you get to live, really live. His voice cracked. I'll miss you every single day. But this isn't goodbye. This is me giving you your life back. He lifted Ember carefully and placed the cub in the carrier. Those amber eyes watched him through the mesh, questioning but not afraid, trusting him even now, especially now. Sarah secured the carrier and loaded it into her vehicle. Marcus stood in the driveway, Emma's arm around his waist, watching as Sarah drove away. He stood there long after the truck disappeared around the bend, staring at the empty road, feeling the absence like a physical wound. Come on, Dad, Emma said eventually, tugging him gently. Let's go inside. They spent the day together, not talking much, just being present. Emma made sandwiches, neither of them ate. They sorted through the supplies that had accumulated, toys, blankets, bottles, deciding what to donate to Sarah's clinic for future rescues. Each item carried a memory. The stuffed animal Ember had slept with, the blue blanket it had loved to burrow under, the small bowl it had finally learned to eat from. "You're doing the right thing," Emma said, watching her father carefully fold the blanket. "You know that, right?" "I know. Doesn't make it hurt less." "No," she agreed, "it doesn't. But Dad, the fact that it hurts this much means you did it right. You loved enough to let go. That's real love," Sarah called that evening. Ember's settling in well, exploring the enclosure, ate dinner, even played with one of the enrichment toys. The staff is impressed with how healthy and well-adjusted it is. "You did amazing work, Marcus. Can I visit?" "Give it a few days. Let Ember adjust to the new environment. Then yes, you can come." "But Marcus, the visits will get harder before they get easier. The center will gradually make Ember wary of humans. It's necessary for survival, but watching that trust disappear—" She paused. "Just prepare yourself." Marcus visited 3 times over the next month. The first time, Ember recognized him immediately, pressing against the enclosure fence, making those familiar sounds. Marcus sat for an hour, talking softly, watching the cub navigate its new world, climbing structures, swimming in the small pond, practicing hunting behaviors with live insects released by the staff. The second visit, 2 weeks later, Ember was more cautious. It approached, sniffed, seemed to remember but didn't press close. The staff had been doing their work, making sudden noises, being unpredictable, teaching wariness. It was working. Ember was becoming wild again. The third visit, Ember barely approached at all. It watched from a distance, alert and cautious, exhibiting the healthy fear of humans that would keep it alive in the wild. Marcus sat outside the enclosure for 45 minutes, and Ember never came closer than 20 feet. "That's good," the center director told him, a kind woman named Patricia with 30 years of wildlife rehabilitation experience. "That's exactly what we want to see. It means release is close. Maybe another few weeks." Marcus nodded, unable to speak. He understood, he agreed. But watching that trust dissolve, seeing Ember look at him like a potential threat, it gutted him in ways he hadn't anticipated. On the drive back to Glacier Falls, he called Emma. "I lost it," he said, his voice thick. "I know I was supposed to. I know it's the goal. But I lost it. It doesn't know me anymore." "It knows you," Emma said firmly. "Not in a way it can show, maybe. But somewhere in there, it remembers the person who stopped, who stayed, who fought. That doesn't disappear, Dad. It just transforms into something else, into survival, into strength. You gave Ember that. You gave it the ability to not need you. That's the greatest gift." Life in Glacier Falls settled into new rhythms. Marcus took the job with Sarah officially, moving into the apartment above the clinic. It was small but comfortable, with windows overlooking the mountains. He learned the work quickly. Animal care, medical assistance, rescue operations. Sarah taught him to splint broken wings, mix medications, read animal behavior. He discovered he had a natural aptitude for it, a patience and gentleness that animals responded to. The town embraced him. Helen invited him for Sunday dinners. Zoe saved him the good booth at the diner. Kyle, before leaving for vet school, taught him everything he knew about the clinic's systems. Slowly, without quite realizing when it happened, Marcus stopped being the trucker passing through and became Marcus who works at the clinic. He became part of the fabric of the community. Emma visited twice more that spring. They hiked in the national park, cooked meals together in his tiny kitchen, talked about everything they'd missed in the years of distance. The relationship wasn't magically healed. There were still careful moments, old wounds that hadn't fully closed, but they were building something new, something honest. "Mum says hi, by the way," Emma mentioned during her last visit in May. "She asked about you, about Ember." "Yeah? She said she always knew you had this in you, the caring, the staying. She just wished you'd found it sooner." Emma looked at him carefully. "She's not angry anymore, Dad. Neither am I. We're just Glad you found your way back to yourself. On a warm June morning, Patricia called. Release day is tomorrow, sunrise. We've identified perfect territory, plenty of prey, no nearby fox populations to create conflict, far from roads. If you want to be there, I do, Marcus said immediately. I absolutely do. He drove to the center in the pre-dawn darkness, meeting Patricia and her team in the parking lot. They loaded the transport carrier, Ember inside, calm but alert, and drove deep into the national forest, following logging roads that eventually gave way to hiking trails. They walked the final mile on foot, carrying equipment, moving quietly through the awakening forest. The release site was perfect, a clearing bordered by dense woods, a stream running through it, morning mist rising like ghosts from the ground. Patricia set the carrier down and stepped back. "You should open it," she told Marcus. "You brought it into this new life. You should be the one to open the door." Marcus knelt beside the carrier, his hands trembling slightly. Through the mesh, he could see Ember, alert, poised, ready. Not the dying cub from the highway, not the fragile patient from the clinic. A fox, complete and wild and perfect. "This is it," Marcus said softly. "This is your home. Your real home." He unlatched the door and swung it open. "Be safe. Be strong. Be everything you were meant to be." For a moment, Ember didn't move. It sat in the carrier, looking out at the forest, at the freedom stretching before it. Then, in one fluid motion, it stepped out onto the grass. The transformation was immediate. Ember's entire posture changed, ears forward, body low, every sense attuned to this new environment. It took 3 steps, stopped, scented the air, took 5 more steps, paused at the stream, drinking deeply. Then it looked back just once, amber eyes finding Marcus across the clearing. For a heartbeat, their gazes locked. And in that moment, Marcus could have sworn he saw recognition, not the tame trust of those early days, but something deeper, an acknowledgement, a thank you, a goodbye. Then Ember turned and melted into the forest, russet fur disappearing among the trees. And it was gone. Marcus stood there as the sun rose higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Patricia's team packed up quietly, giving him space. He listened to the forest waking, bird calls, wind in the pines, the distant sound of something small moving through underbrush. Ember's world now. Ember's life. "Goodbye, little one," Marcus whispered to the forest. "Thank you for stopping with me." He walked back to the truck with the others, climbed into his own vehicle and drove back to Glacier Falls, back to the clinic, to his apartment, to the life he was building. That afternoon, he helped Sarah with a rescue, an injured hawk that someone had found in their barn. He mixed formula for orphaned squirrels. He cleaned enclosures and organized medications and answered phone calls from people who'd found animals in distress. That evening, he called Emma. "It's done. Ember's free. How do you feel?" Marcus considered the question, watching the sunset from his apartment window. "Sad," he admitted, "but also grateful and proud. And like maybe, for the first time in my life, I did something that mattered, really mattered." "You did, Dad. You really did." 6 months later, on a cold December evening, Marcus was closing up the clinic when he heard a sound outside. A sharp bark, distinctly canine but not quite. He stepped out into the parking lot and froze. At the edge of the woods, barely visible in the twilight, stood a fox. Russet coat, glossy in the fading light, amber eyes watching him with alert intelligence. It was too far to be certain, but Marcus knew. He knew the way you know your own heartbeat, your own breath. "Ember?" he whispered. The fox tilted its head, that achingly familiar gesture, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the distance. Then the fox barked once, sharp and clear, and disappeared into the forest. Marcus stood in the snow, tears freezing on his cheeks, and laughed. Not with sadness, but with pure, unfiltered joy. Ember had survived, had thrived, had remembered enough to come back just for a moment, just to say, "I'm here, I'm alive, I'm okay." And that, Marcus thought, walking back inside where Sarah was waiting with hot chocolate and stories about the day's rescues, was everything. The stopping, the staying, the letting go. It had all led to this moment, to knowing that something small and broken had become something wild and whole, to understanding that sometimes saving something else was really about saving yourself. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and if you've ever witnessed or lived something like this.